What's the scariest true story you've heard or told? This happened to me. This is from the days when I used to live back home. I used to live in Karachi, Pakistan, but now moved to UK. We used to live very close to a CID, Police Investigation Department aka Pakistani FBI, building which we all were unaware of and always thought it was just an ordinary government building till on 11th November 2010. On that day around evening time coming home from work I thought I'd better hit the gym because they had a sauna, and after being tired from all day work that sounded like a good idea, which was hardly 3 miles away, so I decided to walk to the gym. I change quickly and leave for the gym and start walking towards the gym. This is almost I'd hardly walked like 10 minutes and I'm 1 miles away roughly, and all of a sudden for a nanosecond I feel that ground is shaking, and the next thing I hear is the loudest bang I've ever heard, followed by a pressure kick into my chest. Now to let you guys know, my both the ears started bleeding because the bang was so loud, and for the reference the kick in the chest was as bad as Big Show wearing military boots and kicking you in the chest straight with full force. Next thing, I'm on the ground covering my ears because they are in agony and covered in dirt, trying to figure out what's happening. As I'm trying to figure out, I can see all the cars' alarms have gone off. Anything made up of glass has been shattered in roughly 1 to 2 miles area. I'm still trying to figure out what has happened, and I start smelling gunpowder and as if someone is making a BBQ and is being burnt. I will always remember that smell, which was something unsettling. Next things, rock and dust particles starts landing on me and the surrounding areas, which had 1 to 1.5 inches long of pieces of human skin and flesh. I'm not believing that I have another human skin piece stuck to my arm. I brush up my clothes and arms, getting up and covering my ear, recovering from that pressure kick. As I move closer to a spot in a street where I'm hearing loads of people screaming and crying, I see a few 3-5 foot cracks between some walls of the building which have been destroyed by the shockwave of the bang. I see the gap between a wall and move into the area where I see these scenes straight from a Hollywood movie where people are crying, cars on fire and dead bodies on the ground. By this time I'm thinking it's a bomb blast, and that's what has happened. As I move closer I see a 10 feet and 30 feet wide crater which has been filled with the water, and the building, which was a CID building, is no longer there. There are hundreds of people lying on the ground crying for help, as some of them don't even have legs or limbs, or some don't have their complete bottom. I'm still in a state of shock looking around, and I see a woman crying and hitting herself because she had her husband dead whose legs and torso was missing. I seen that later. I see several people without legs, brains out and no limbs. One thing which haunted me for sure was a 20 years old guy who was dead and lying on the floor towards his chest on the floor with his neck turned towards me. I can still remember him looking straight into my eyes. His feet were flipped the other way around. After the police arrived and media arrived, I came back home. After it got crowded. After I came home after the dusk every day, I would see that 20 years old boy standing and staring into my eyes. I would wake up screaming throughout the night and see that guy standing at the doorway just staring at me. For 2 to 3 weeks I would see this guy regularly during midnight, standing in my hallway staring through my soul. I still remember that guy's face and the shockwave and the sound of the blast. P.S. To this day, even the slightest bang or even a loud music drops freaks me out, sometimes reminding me of that shockwave. I'm married, so sometimes I tell my wife that the bang just reminded me of the shockwave I witnessed in this accident. I don't tell her, but inside my heart I pray secretly that God don't ever put anyone through that, even in their wildest dreams. Photo of the explosion aftermath link. com/nio60f. Edit. Thank you to whoever gave me my first gold award. I'm thankful to all of your kind comments. When I was a little girl, 9 years old or thereabouts, I was playing at the school down the street from my house. It was the middle of summer and myself and a girlfriend were hanging around watching the boys play street hockey. One of the boys called my name and said a man in the parking lot was looking for me. The parking lot was mostly obscured by the building, but I could see an old 70s style van that hadn't been there earlier. I was walking over to the van when the mother of one of the other kids showed up looking for her son and asked me what I was doing. When I told her someone in the van was looking for me, she took my hand and started to walk with me, and the van pulled out and sped away. Friend's mom walked me home, and I wasn't allowed out of my yard without my parents. For the rest of the summer, I was so upset and didn't understand why I was being punished. It was only years later that I understood that I was likely being targeted by some opportunistic scumbag for who knows what. Thanks Mrs. Gibson. Wherever you are. Edited to add, thanks for all the awards. Kind internet strangers. Just wanted to address a few facts. My parents didn't say they were punishing me. They just kept me close to the house. So I assumed that I was being punished. I lived in a very small, safe we don't lock our doors town. Kids roamed the streets from sunup until sundown. Typically, playing in the old quarries, and on railway tracks, and on gigantic limestone hills. And all kinds of shit we'd never let our kids do now. A few people were worried about Mrs. Giston's son. He was fine. We all were. She had come in from the other entrance to the schoolyard behind us, whereas the boys were closer to the parking lot. I barely got within shouting distance of the van before it sped off. Most kids are unfortunately abducted by people they know. So I have no way of knowing if it was some creep who knew me from all the activities my parents had us in, or just some opportunist guy who said to the boy, "You know that girl over there? Can you call her over for me?" We were all taught about stranger danger. Shout out to Canadians who remember. Stay alert. Stay safe. Link. BuzzFeed.com/RobCernic/stay alert stay safe / and because Mrs. Gibson showed up. I'll never know if those lessons sunk in or not. Short story. My wife is from Enterprise. And I guess a kid in her school got beheaded on his way home. Was literally found with his head cut off on the side of the street, and to this day no one knows who did it or how it happened. Absolutely gives me chills. My HIV story. I was on a trip on my first commercial flight from Sacramento to San Diego to visit my girlfriend, and I didn't feel well. Once I got off the plane I made it to the hotel and had bouts of nausea and diarrhea for a few days straight and finally decided to go to hospital. After waiting hours I was let into a room and some time later an Asian woman wearing a mask and gloves entered. "Please leave the room," she told my girlfriend. "Let's call Beatrice." "No, she can stay, it's okay," I said. The doctor still hadn't looked at me, but looked back to Beatrice. "I think you should leave." I looked to Beatrice and said, "Can you please wait outside?" Right as the door closed the doctor said, "You have HIV." My mind instantly started racing, trying to problem solve. I can't have AIDS. I got tested before being with Beatrice and I was clean. I said. The doctor again, "You have HIV," while avoiding eye contact. I looked at my palms and for the first time in my life they were sweating. Really sweating. I said again, "I can't. I've been tested." The doctor flipped a page and asked my name, which I responded. And finally the doctor's eyes made contact with my own. "I'm so sorry. I have the wrong chart. You have strep throat and laryngitis." I remember the world ending and then the feeling the most relief I've ever experienced in my life. When I told Beatrice the whole story she awkwardly laughed and said, "But you don't have AIDS, right?" To this day, when I tell people what happened a good portion say, "But you don't have AIDS, right?" Whole lot of ducking no. I'm a crime writer and once interviewed a woman who told me an unrelated horror story about something that happened to her as a girl. When she was like 10, she had trouble sleeping and imagined the boogeyman was living in her closet, staring at her during the night. Every night she would come down and tell her parents, and every night her father would tell her the boogeyman didn't exist and she should go back to bed. Well, this happened for several nights and the father got tired of it. So that night he walked her back to her bedroom, turned on the light, and said, "I'll show you there's no boogeyman," and went to open the closet door. But something on the other side held it shut. He sent his daughter out of the room and forced the door open to find that a man was inside. He'd been sneaking into their house every night to stand in the girl's closet and watch her, and maybe more. He beat the ever-loving shit out of the man and the man went to prison. When I interviewed this woman I looked him up online. He'd recently gotten out on parole and had skipped out on his weekly checks. There was a warrant out for his arrest and nobody knew where he was anymore. Edit. People are asking for the source. I googled his name for the first time in years and, well, the good news is he's in prison again. Link. News 5 Cleveland.com/news/local news/Oklahoma/Cleveland man sentenced to 20 years after trying to film people showering in Geneva State Park. My mom was stalked by a guy in her chemistry class. This was back in the late 70s. During her first semester at college. They were lab partners, and mom thought he seemed cute and nice, and was too shy at the time to ask him out. But she said, if he'd asked her out, she went. They were friendly with each other in class, but their paths didn't cross outside of that, since they were in different majors. As the semester wore on, however, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside of her other classes, the library, the student union, out in front where her dad picked her up and dropped her off. This continued into the spring semester. Puzzled, but not yet alarmed, she asked him how he always seemed to know where she was. He proudly said, "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule." My mom went to complain to the secretary who gave out her schedule, and the secretary blew it off, because you guys are dating. Luckily, mom had already arranged to transfer to a different school for sophomore year, and spent the remaining time left avoiding him. She never saw him after that. But it wasn't over. Flash forward to grad school. Mom was at work, and grandma gets a knock on the door. Since the man at the door was in a naval uniform, and my grandmother was a Navy nurse, she let the man in. Because he looked rather sad, he starts off by saying how sorry he is for my mother's loss, which completely mystified grandma. Well, mom, I just got back from overseas, and I found out my friend recently killed himself. He spoke so highly of his fiancée, your daughter, and I wanted to meet her. My grandmother told him her daughter didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment, let alone a fiancé. It doesn't take too long to establish the man's deceased friend in question was in fact mom's stalker. The naval lieutenant was pretty upset, and my grandmother even more so. She made him leave before mom got home. The weird thing about the stalker's death is that it was ruled a suicide. But he hanged himself from a very high up tree branch you'd need a ladder to get to, and his hands were tied behind his back. From what my mother later learned, he had a tendency to snoop and generally stick his nose in places they didn't belong besides the obvious stalking thing. And this didn't win him too many friends. So it's anyone's guess who he might have pissed off. My mom always concludes this story kind of nonchalantly, like, yeah, back in those days, they didn't really know much about stalking. They've gotten a little better in terms of awareness now. It gives me the creeps to think what could have happened if he escalated his attempts to follow her after she left that school. When I was a kid we lived on a large acreage. One night we came home late, and as we entered the driveway we noticed a car pulled over down the road against the ditch that bordered our property. We saw two people, one of them climbing out of the ditch. When we parked my mom told my dad to go see if they were okay or needed help. My dad said that they looked to be okay and it was probably not a good idea, so we all went in and to bed. The next morning we were woken up by the police. They had our whole yard taped off because some horseback riders had noticed a leg sticking out of a black plastic bag in the ditch exactly where that car was parked. That look on my mom's face I'll never forget. We know for sure my dad wouldn't have made it back home alive if he had listened to my mom that night. There was a man who got out of his car after it broke down on the highway and attempted to walk across the highway to the other side late at night. He was hit by a car and his body was driven over so many times that by the time the sun came up his body parts were scattered across 300 meters of highway. Link. com/v2rkxfj. Edit. Link to image of event. When I was about 5, woke up to my house, surrounded by loud voices and bright white lights. A group of robbers broke into our house after some kind of heist and were using us as hostages with rifles. The police had our house surrounded, my parents, grandparents, and I didn't really speak English back then. So my 12-year-old sister had to translate the demands to the police and instructions to us. My grandma told me to go back to sleep, which I somehow easily did. Edit. The end of the story. After falling asleep and waking up the next day, everything was fine. The only thing everyone kept talking about were where the robbers were standing. They decided not to have too many entrances from the house, so they barricaded themselves in our kitchen. Apparently the entire kitchen floor was covered in guns. I kept asking what happened, but my family was firmly in the mindset of don't tell the kids anything. Ever. Since little kid me was kind of dumb and nothing really happened to me directly. I forgot about the situation for years. I asked again, but they still don't want to talk about it. It's still kind of scary to think that, had they wanted to, I could have died in my sleep that night. Please click subscribe if you enjoyed this video.